My name is Melanie, and at Christmas my parents turned away my 15-year-old daughter at the door. She had to walk home alone in the freezing snow carrying every handmade gift she had brought, and was left to spend Christmas Eve shivering in an empty apartment hallway. When I found her, I did not shout or cry. I took action. 12 hours later, their perfect lives started to unravel. I am now 34 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a major firm in Seattle. My job is to dig through complex financial records, find the missing numbers, and expose the truth that corrupt people desperately try to hide. I am very good at what I do, navigating labyrinths of offshore accounts and hidden assets with absolute precision. But my family never cared about my career. To my mother, Beverly, and my father, Howard, I was simply the family mistake, the unwanted daughter who got pregnant at 19 and ruined their pristine image. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who treated you like a burden. It was 2 in the morning on Christmas Day. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift, unraveling a massive corporate fraud case for a client. I was exhausted physically and emotionally drained. The drive back to my modest apartment was quiet, the city streets empty and covered in a thick, undisturbed blanket of fresh snow. I kept the heater on high, letting the warmth seep into my tired bones, while soft holiday music played on the radio. All I wanted was to crawl into bed and wake up later to celebrate a quiet, peaceful holiday with my wonderful daughter Lily. But as I stepped off the elevator onto my floor, my heart stopped. Lily was curled up in a tight ball on the thin, rough carpet outside our apartment door. She was wearing her thin winter coat, shivering violently against the frigid draft of the hallway, with her lips a pale, terrifying shade of blue. Her arms were wrapped tightly around a crushed cardboard box holding the delicate handmade ornaments she had spent weeks crafting for her grandparents. I dropped my heavy briefcase, letting it hit the wooden floor with a loud thud, and rushed to her, falling to my knees on the cold tile. I pulled her into my arms, feeling the icy dampness of her clothes soaking through my own coat. She had been crying for so long that her tears had practically frozen on her cheeks. I quickly unlocked the door and guided her inside, wrapping her in the thickest blankets I could find. As I rubbed her hands to bring some warmth back into her fingers, she finally found the breath to speak. Her voice was small and broken, carrying the weight of a rejection no child should ever have to face. She told me she wanted to surprise my parents with her heartfelt gifts, so she walked 3 long miles through the biting wind and heavy snow to their gated estate in the affluent suburbs. She thought they would be happy to see her standing there on Christmas Eve. Instead, my mother Beverly only opened the massive front door a few restrictive inches, blocking the entrance completely. Lily said the house behind her was bright, warm, and filled with festive laughter. My sister Amanda and her arrogant husband Preston were inside hosting Preston's wealthy conservative parents for a lavish holiday dinner. My mother looked down at her own granddaughter, standing shivering in the freezing snow, and openly sneered with undisguised contempt. She told Lily that Amanda's in-laws were very traditional people who did not want to look at a teenager born out of wedlock. She told her to go home, calling her a stain on the family image. Then she shut the heavy oak door completely, leaving a 15-year-old girl alone in the dark, freezing night. I listened to her trembling words and felt a profound, chilling silence settle over my heart. I did not scream. I did not throw things or break down in tears. Decades of dealing with my parents had burned away my capacity for emotional outbursts. They had always favored Amanda, the golden child who married into money and maintained the flawless facade they valued above all else. I was the scapegoat, the outcast they only acknowledged when they needed someone to look down upon. But targeting my innocent daughter was a line they should never have crossed. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the stove, and calmly prepared a steaming mug of hot cocoa for Lily. The rhythmic stirring of the metal spoon against the ceramic mug perfectly matched the cold, methodical calculation taking over my mind. I was not going to let them get away with this abuse any longer. I was going to dismantle their pristine fake reality piece by piece. I brought the mug back to the living room and watched as Lily slowly sipped the warm drink, the color beginning to return to her pale face. While she rested, I opened my laptop. My parents had spent years controlling the narrative, claiming they had financially supported my supposed mistakes. They loved to loudly tell their high society friends how much they sacrificed for their supposedly wayward daughter. I accessed my secure digital archives and pulled up a specific bank statement from 15 years ago. It clearly showed the payment for my hospital bills when I gave birth to Lily at 19. Every single cent came from the savings I had scraped together, working 2 jobs. My parents had not contributed a dime. They had actually refused to pay for anything, forcing me to figure it out on my own while they continued to fund Amanda's lavish lifestyle. With the proof glowing on my screen, I turned back to my daughter. I took out my phone and snapped a single photograph of Lily, huddled under the blankets, her hair still damp from the snow, her face etched with the exhaustion of a cruel betrayal. I attached the picture to a text message, along with a screenshot of that 15-year-old bank statement. I sent the message to only one person. My 88-year-old great-grandmother, Evelyn. She was the true matriarch of our family, the brilliant one who built the wealth my parents now paraded around as their own. Evelyn possessed a sharp mind and possessed zero tolerance for cruelty or pretense. She had always seen right through my mother's superficial charm and my father's hollow boasting. I hit send, placed my phone on the table, and sat beside Lily until she finally drifted into a troubled sleep. I stayed awake, watching the snow continue to fall heavily outside our living room window, calculating my next deliberate steps. At exactly 6 in the morning, the screen of my phone lit up with a notification. It was a reply from Great-Grandma Evelyn. The message contained just 3 sentences, but they carried the weight of a coming storm. She wrote that she had already called her lawyer. She instructed me to bring my audit files to my parents. Christmas lunch at noon. The final sentence read, "It is time to take out the trash and finally burn their entire fake empire to the ground." I packed my heavy leather briefcase with every printed financial record I had pulled during the early morning hours and drove straight to my parents' sprawling suburban mansion. The freshly plowed driveway was overflowing with luxury vehicles belonging to Amanda and Preston, as well as his wealthy traditional family members. I parked my modest sedan at the very end of the street and walked up the long stone pathway. The sounds of clinking crystal and loud cheerful laughter drifted through the massive front doors. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The entryway was decorated with an absurd amount of festive garland and imported poinsettias. From the formal dining room, I could hear my father Howard holding court. His booming voice echoed off the marble floors as he delivered a self-congratulatory toast. I walked quietly toward the dining room archway and stood out of sight for a moment to observe the spectacle. Howard was standing at the head of the long dining table with a crystal champagne flute raised high in the air. Preston sat to his right, looking impossibly smug in a tailored suit, while Amanda beamed proudly beside him. Amanda wore a shimmering floor-length designer gown that looked more appropriate for a red carpet gala than a family Christmas lunch. The parents of Preston sat across from them, nodding along to the arrogant speech my father gave. Howard went on and on about the recent promotion Preston received at his investment firm, praising him as the son he always wanted. He spoke about family legacy and the importance of maintaining an impeccable reputation in their elite social circles. I gripped the handle of my briefcase tightly. The sheer hypocrisy of his words tasted bitter in my throat. Just 12 hours ago, they had turned my shivering teenage daughter away into a blinding snowstorm to protect this exact fraudulent image. I stepped out of the shadows and into the bright light of the dining room. The moment my boots clicked against the hardwood floor, The joyful chatter died instantly. Amanda was the first to react. She set her champagne glass down with a sharp clink and looked me up and down with undisguised disgust. Her eyes locked onto my thick, practical winter coat. It was a durable, dark gray parka designed for harsh weather and long walks in the snow. It was exactly the kind of coat my daughter had been wearing last night. Amanda let out a short, mocking laugh that broke the stunned silence. She loudly asked why I was wearing such a hideous, cheap coat to a formal holiday gathering. She told me I looked like a lost delivery driver who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. She smoothed the skirt of her expensive silk gown and leaned closer to Preston. She loudly whispered that I always went out of my way to look impoverished, just to make the family look bad. The parents of Preston shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed chairs and exchanged judgmental glances. They were conservative people who clearly did not know what to make of the sudden tension. I stood my ground at the end of the table and stared directly at my sister. I did not raise my voice or react to her childish provocation. I simply told her that my coat was designed for surviving the cold reality of the actual world, rather than playing dress-up in a fake one. My calm tone only seemed to irritate her further. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but Howard quickly stepped around the table to intervene. His face was flushed with anger, but he forced a tight, artificial smile for the sake of his wealthy guests. He grabbed my arm with a crushing grip and physically pulled me away from the dining table toward the secluded hallway near the kitchen. He hissed at me through gritted teeth, asking what I thought I was doing showing up uninvited. I reminded him that this was a family Christmas lunch, and I was technically part of the family. Howard scoffed and reached into the inside pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp white envelope and shoved it roughly against my chest. He told me he knew I was probably struggling to pay my rent again. He said he had written me a check for $5,000 to help cover my pathetic lifestyle. He explicitly called it a charity donation. Then his voice dropped to a vicious whisper. He told me to take the money and leave immediately through the back door. He said my presence was embarrassing the traditional parents of Preston and ruining the elegant atmosphere they had worked so hard to cultivate. He told me I was a stain on their perfect holiday and that I needed to take my charity money and disappear before I humiliated them any further. I looked down at the envelope in my hand and then back up at my father. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. For years, I had allowed their wealth and status to intimidate me. I had allowed them to treat me like a burden because I chose to keep my child and build my own career from the ground up as a forensic accountant. They truly believed their money made them untouchable. I pulled the check out of the envelope. It was indeed written out for $5,000, signed with the bold, arrogant signature of Howard. I held it up between us. I asked him if this was the going rate to make his unwanted daughter disappear. Howard smirked and told me not to push my luck. He said I should be grateful he was giving me anything at all. I did not break eye contact as I placed my hands on opposite ends of the crisp paper. With one swift motion, I ripped the check straight down the middle. The smug expression on Howard vanished instantly. I ripped the pieces again and again until the check was nothing but worthless confetti. I stepped right back into the formal dining room. The guests watched in stunned silence as I walked up to his abandoned place setting. I held my hands over his crystal champagne flute and let the shredded pieces fall like snow into the expensive bubbling liquid. Howard stormed back into the room, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger at me and began shouting violent threats about ensuring my permanent financial ruin forever. I waited for him to finish before calmly opening my leather briefcase. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to my father. He snatched it, and his eyes widened in absolute shock. I casually informed him that his prestigious exclusive country club membership had fallen into severe debt. I smiled and revealed that the debt collection agency had recently bundled and sold those outstanding accounts. I told him I was the lead forensic accountant and majority partner of the private financial firm that bought his debt. I was now the sole person dictating his social survival. Howard began shouting new threats, but his frantic yelling was abruptly cut short. The heavy double doors of the dining room suddenly swung open. Great-Grandma Evelyn entered flanked by two ruthless corporate attorneys. She pointed her cane directly at Howard. "Freeze all family accounts immediately. Melanie, start the audit." The silence that followed Great-Grandma Evelyn making her declaration was absolute and heavy. No one dared to breathe or make a single sudden movement. The crystal chandelier above the dining table seemed to hum in the sudden vacuum of sound. The parents of Preston sat frozen, staring at the two ruthless corporate attorneys standing rigidly by the door. Then the fragile spell broke, and absolute chaos erupted across the room. Beverly sprang from her chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed loudly against the antique mahogany sideboard. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. Her features were twisted into a mask of sheer panic and rage. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that I had somehow manipulated a vulnerable, senile old woman into turning against her own flesh and blood. She turned her frantic attention to the corporate attorneys and demanded they intervene immediately. She loudly claimed I was committing elder abuse and threatened to call the authorities. Evelyn did not even blink. She simply tightened her grip on her silver-handled cane and stared my mother down with eyes like chips of flint. She told Beverly to close her mouth and sit down before she humiliated herself further in front of their esteemed guests. Seeing his mother-in-law completely falter, Preston decided this was his perfect moment to take control of the room and assert his dominance. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the pristine cuffs of his expensive tailored suit, and stepped squarely into my path. He looked down his nose at me using the exact same condescending tone he likely reserved for valets and waitstaff. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game that I could not possibly win. He boasted loudly that his prestigious investment firm retained a massive team of elite, ruthless corporate litigators who would gladly crush my little accounting business into dust. He promised to tie me up in endless, aggressive litigation for the next decade until I was utterly bankrupt, and begging them for a meager settlement out of court. He sneered, taking another step forward. He told me to pack up my briefcase and take my elderly relative home before he personally called the local police to have me arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage. I did not blink. I did not flinch or take a single step back. I ignored his childish posturing entirely. I simply lifted my worn leather briefcase and set it directly onto the center of their pristine holiday table, right next to the roasted turkey and the expensive crystal gravy boats. I unclasped the heavy brass locks and pulled out my silver laptop. I opened the screen and let my fingers rest lightly on the keyboard. Preston scoffed loudly, asking if I was deaf or just completely stupid. I continued to ignore him. In under 3 minutes, my fingers flew across the keys with practiced, absolute precision. Howard had always been arrogant enough to believe his home network was an impenetrable fortress, but he still used the exact same basic security protocol I had installed for him over 10 years ago. It was pathetically easy to bypass. I effortlessly connected to the local network and accessed the massive smart television mounted on the far wall of the dining room. The giant screen flickered to life, instantly replacing the ambient holiday fireplace video with the crisp, glaring white background of my professional forensic accounting software. The parents of Preston gasped aloud as a complex, detailed spreadsheet materialized on the screen for everyone to see. The numbers were large, bold, and impossible to ignore. I tapped a key and highlighted a specific row in bright, blinding yellow. I turned my attention to Howard, who was suddenly sweating profusely and clutching the edge of the dining table for support. I announced to the silent room that we were looking at the official family trust ledgers. Specifically, I wanted to draw everyone's attention to a particular restricted account established exactly 15 years ago. I pointed to the screen where the initial deposit date perfectly matched the month my daughter Lily was born. I explained that Great-Grandma Evelyn had generously set up a comprehensive protected college fund for Lily to ensure she would never have to struggle to pay for her higher education. It was a beautiful, secure financial safety net designed to mature the moment Lily turned 18. Then I scrolled down the page, revealing the devastating truth. I highlighted a series of massive unauthorized withdrawals that began exactly 3 years ago. The funds were completely drained, siphoned off in large calculated chunks month after month, until the account balance hit zero. I looked directly at Amanda, who was suddenly gripping her white linen napkin with pale, shaking hands. I told the room that Howard had secretly emptied the entire college fund. He did not lose the money in a bad investment or use it to save a failing family business venture. He deliberately stole it to buy the twin boys of Amanda their coveted spots in an elite private academy. He traded the secure future of my daughter so Amanda could brag to her shallow country club friends about the prestigious custom uniforms her children wore to school every day. The parents of Preston looked absolutely horrified by this revelation. They stared at Howard with open disgust. Preston himself turned a pale, sickly shade of gray as he stared at the undeniable projected proof of his father-in-law committing grand larceny against his own family. But Beverly did not show a single ounce of shame or remorse for the betrayal. Instead, she viciously doubled down on the crime. She slammed her hands flat on the dining table, causing the expensive silverware to rattle against the fine china plates. She glared at me with absolute venom and loudly defended the malicious theft. She proudly claimed that the twin boys of Amanda were brilliant, exceptional children who deserved the absolute best elite education money could buy. She yelled that those boys actually had a bright, successful future ahead of them. She gestured aggressively toward me and openly sneered that Lily was nothing but a bastard child who would likely end up working a miserable minimum wage job just to survive. Beverly loudly declared that giving that massive amount of money to Lily would have been a complete waste of valuable family resources. She stated that Howard had done the right thing by investing the stolen funds in the children who actually mattered to their high society image. I listened to my mother desperately justify stealing from her own freezing, innocent granddaughter. A heavy, icy calm settled deep within my chest. I slowly lowered my hands and closed my laptop with a soft, definitive click. I looked directly at Beverly and smiled coldly. "That is fascinating, Beverly," I said smoothly. "Let us see if the future of Preston is just as bright." I explained that I had securely forwarded this exact ledger to the Internal Revenue Service at 6 o'clock this morning. I detailed exactly how Preston had used his senior position at his elite investment firm to help Howard launder that stolen college fund, so the illegal transactions would appear completely legitimate. I watched the arrogant smirk completely vanish from his face as the absolute reality of his impending destruction crashed down hard upon his perfectly manicured shoulders right in front of me. Good luck with the federal indictment, Preston. By 9 o'clock the very next morning, my office phone rang. The receptionist informed me 2 women were causing a massive disturbance. I walked out of my glass office and looked down the corridor to see my mother and sister screaming at the security guards. Beverly aggressively waved her designer handbag, demanding I call off the audit immediately. Amanda shrieked that I was trying to ruin her marriage out of pure jealousy. I simply nodded to the head of security, who guided them to the exit. Beverly dug her expensive heels into the carpet and threatened to destroy my reputation. She screamed she would tell everyone at the prestigious Boxing Day gala tonight that I was a deranged extortionist trying to blackmail my own family. Amanda yelled, I would never be able to show my face in society again. They completely misunderstood the situation. I was holding the match to burn it down. My parents and Amanda spent the entire afternoon executing a frantic smear campaign. Through wealthy clients, I heard the ridiculous rumors spreading across country club text chains. They claimed I was a bankrupt single mother who had suffered a massive mental breakdown. They expected me to hide out of shame. They assumed I would be too intimidated to show up at the annual Boxing Day gala. They were wrong. I spent the evening getting ready with deliberate precision. I chose a stunning floor-length emerald green gown tailored perfectly to my frame. It radiated quiet power. I looked flawless and entirely unbothered by the chaos I had unleashed. When I arrived at the Seattle Country Club, the air in the grand ballroom was thick with expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light. The moment I stepped through the arched doorway, the ambient chatter died down to a collective whisper. Heads turned, expecting me to look like the erratic mess my mother described. Instead, I commanded the room, walking to the bar with a confident smile. From across the ballroom, I saw Amanda notice my arrival. Her eyes widened in shock and narrowed into pure fury. She slammed her drink down onto a passing waiter tray and marched directly across the crowded dance floor toward me. Beverly and Howard trailed anxiously behind her, trying to maintain dignified smiles while panicking. Amanda closed the distance, breathing heavily. Her face was flushed and angry red. She demanded to know what I was doing there and hissed that I was not welcome among decent people. I took a slow sip of water and told her I had every right to be there. I casually mentioned that my firm handled the private accounts for half the board of directors in this very room. The realization that I held far more actual power in this building than she did pushed her over the edge. Her fragile composure shattered completely. Amanda raised her hand high into the air, aiming a vicious open palm slap directly at my face. She wanted to humiliate me in front of hundreds of people. She wanted to physically punish me for exposing the fraudulent reality of her perfect life. Before her hand could make contact, I moved with swift, effortless precision. I reached up and caught her wrist in midair. My grip was tight and absolute. Her arm jerked to a sudden halt, and a collective gasp echoed from the surrounding guests, who were openly watching the drama unfold. Amanda struggled to pull her arm away, but I held her firmly in place. I looked directly into her panicked eyes, keeping my voice perfectly level. I told her throwing a violent tantrum in public was not going to save Preston from federal prison. I released her wrist, and she stumbled backward, clutching her arm. Howard pushed past his daughter, his face twisted into a mask of authoritarian rage. He turned to the crowd and demanded someone call security. He yelled that I was a trespassing lunatic who had assaulted his daughter. He expected the staff to drag me out into the freezing night, just like he had done to my innocent daughter. A man in a crisp black tuxedo stepped out from the whispering crowd. It was the general manager of the country club. Howard smiled in triumph and pointed a thick finger at my chest. He instructed the manager to have me escorted off the premises immediately. The manager stopped a few feet away and clasped his hands professionally. He did not look at me. He looked directly at my father. He cleared his throat, and his voice carried clearly across the silent ballroom. He addressed my father by his full name and informed him there had been a significant change in his membership status. Howard lowered his pointing finger, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He reminded the manager he had been a premium member for 20 years. The manager pulled a sleek tablet from his pocket and consulted the screen. He stated with chilling professionalism that the accounting department had conducted an emergency review of his accounts. He announced to the listening crowd that Howard was over 6 months delinquent on his exorbitant membership dues. Howard sputtered and quickly claimed it was a simple bank error. He tried to laugh it off to the surrounding guests, but the manager did not smile. The manager stepped closer and lowered his voice just enough to maintain decorum while ensuring the nearest guests could still hear every word. He informed Howard that the board of directors had held an emergency meeting an hour ago. They had been made aware of the severe allegations regarding his stolen trust funds and the impending federal investigations surrounding his son-in-law. The manager stated the country club maintained a strict moral clause. The board simply could not tolerate such unsavory financial associations within their elite ranks. Howard stood completely frozen. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and old. Beverly let out a horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The wealthy friends they spent decades impressing were now actively stepping away from them, treating them like a contagious disease. Amanda tried to hide behind her mother, her earlier bravado completely vanished. The manager reached into his inner pocket and produced a small pair of silver scissors. He held out his hand and calmly requested that Howard surrender his premium membership card. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out the heavy metal card, handing it over with trembling fingers. The sound of the thick card being snipped into 2 jagged pieces echoed loudly in the quiet room. The manager handed the pieces back to Howard and politely asked him to leave the gala immediately as they were no longer welcome on the property. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious destruction of the social empire they prized above all else. They had turned my daughter away in the cold, to protect this exact illusion of grandeur, and now that illusion was completely shattered. As the surrounding crowd whispered among themselves, a sudden sharp ringing sound broke through the tension. It was the cell phone of my father. In his absolute panic and confusion, he fumbled with the device, pulling it from his pocket with shaking hands. His finger accidentally swiped the wrong button, and the call connected on speakerphone, projecting the voice of the caller loudly into the silent ballroom. A stern, automated voice from his primary banking institution announced that his accounts were critically overdrawn. The representative on the line then stated clearly that immediate foreclosure proceedings on his luxury suburban estate had officially begun. The morning sun barely pierced the gray clouds over Seattle as I poured coffee in my kitchen. Lily was safely reading in her bedroom, enjoying the quiet of the day after Christmas. The silence was abruptly shattered by a violent pounding on my front door. The heavy thuds rattled the cheap wooden frame on its hinges. I set my mug down, took a calming breath, and walked over to unbolt the lock. Before I could turn the knob, Howard pushed his weight against the door and forced his way inside. Beverly and Amanda marched closely behind him like frantic, angry shadows. They looked entirely different from the polished socialites who had paraded around the country club just 12 hours ago. The eyes of my father were bloodshot, and his face was tight with desperate rage. Beverly looked pale, her expensive makeup smudged from crying over her shattered social status. Amanda glared at my modest apartment with absolute disgust, crossing her arms tightly. Howard did not waste a second on pleasantries. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and demanded that I stop my cyber attacks immediately. He shouted that I had maliciously hacked into his personal bank accounts and manufactured a fake foreclosure notice just to humiliate him. He yelled that he had spent the entire night frantically calling his financial advisors, trying to fix the massive mess I had supposedly orchestrated. Beverly chimed in, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She accused me of being a vindictive monster, actively trying to destroy the family name. She cried their oldest friends were already ignoring her phone calls, and the country club incident was front-page gossip. Amanda sneered that I was a jealous, bitter woman who could not stand to see them happy. They stood in my small living room, radiating toxic entitlement, fully expecting me to cower under their attack. I leaned against my counter and watched them completely exhaust their energy. I told Howard I had not hacked into anything. I explained that forensic accountants do not need to invent fake numbers when the real ones are already screaming the truth. Howard stepped closer, invading my personal space, attempting to physically intimidate me. He puffed his chest and lowered his voice to a threatening snarl. He told me I had made a massive miscalculation thinking I could back him into a corner. He proclaimed he was still a powerful man with extensive connections and substantial resources. He refused to let an ungrateful daughter ruin the life he had spent decades building. Howard crossed his arms and a cruel smirk spread across his aging face. He told me he knew exactly how to put me back in my place. He announced he had spent the early morning looking into the property records for this miserable dump of an apartment building. He discovered the property was operated by a corporate entity called Horizon Management Group. Howard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in my kitchen. He bragged he had personally called the primary leasing office just an hour ago. He spoke directly to a leasing agent and offered to pay double my current monthly rent in cash if they would immediately terminate my lease. He boasted that money talks in the real world, and no property manager was going to turn down a massive cash bribe just to protect a nobody tenant. Amanda smiled maliciously and chimed in that I was going to need my winter coat because I would be sleeping outside very soon. Howard leaned in closer and promised that by the end of the week, he was going to watch the property management company throw me and Lily out onto the freezing street. He said he would not stop until I was utterly destitute and begging him for forgiveness on my hands and knees. I listened to his vicious threat and stared into his triumphant, bloodshot eyes. A warm bubble of amusement rose in my chest. I tried to suppress it, but the absolute absurdity of his arrogant bragging was simply too much to contain. I broke into a bright, genuine laugh. It was not a cold, calculated chuckle, but a deep, resonant laugh that filled the entire apartment. My parents and Amanda completely froze. Their victorious smirks vanished, replaced by genuine confusion. They were fully expecting me to burst into terrified tears or drop to my knees and beg for mercy. Seeing me laugh at their ultimate threat completely short-circuited their arrogant minds. Beverly demanded to know what was so funny, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I shook my head and wiped a tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. I turned my back on them and walked over to my home office desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick binder filled with notarized legal documents. I carried the heavy binder back to the kitchen and dropped it onto the counter right in front of Howard. The loud thud made Amanda flinch. I flipped the binder open to the first section and tapped my index finger against the official corporate registry documents. I told Howard to read the top line. He leaned forward, squinting at the dense legal text. The blood rapidly drained from his face as his eyes scanned the official state registration. I calmly explained that I was not just a tenant in this building. I told him I was the original founder and current chief executive officer of Horizon Management Group. I informed my father that the confused leasing agent he had spoken to on the phone this morning worked directly for me. I smiled and thanked him for his generous offer to double my rent, but I kindly declined his pathetic bribe. Amanda gasped and took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the hallway wall. Beverly covered her mouth with a trembling hand, unable to process the magnitude of her colossal failure. Howard opened and closed his mouth repeatedly, resembling a suffocating fish stranded on dry land. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords simply refused to cooperate. Before he could formulate a coherent sentence, I turned to the next section of the legal binder. I told him I was not finished presenting the facts. I pointed out that 2 years ago his shady offshore investments had taken a massive, catastrophic downturn. He had nearly lost the luxurious, sprawling suburban estate he currently lived in. A private, unseen holding firm had mysteriously swooped in at the last second and purchased the deed to his property, preventing an immediate physical seizure by his aggressive bank. I watched his eyes widen in pure terror as he stared down at the crisp printed pages sitting on my kitchen counter. I revealed that my property management firm had orchestrated that exact purchase. For the past 2 years, they had not been paying a traditional mortgage to a faceless, forgiving bank. They had been paying monthly rent disguised as a mortgage directly into my corporate accounts. I reached into the deep front pocket of my gray sweater and pulled out a single folded piece of thick white paper. I smoothly unfolded it and handed it directly to my pale, violently shaking parents. I looked them straight in the eyes and watched their entire privileged existence shatter into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. I handed my pale, shaking parents a 72-hour eviction notice. Your absolute foreclosure was not from the bank, it was from me. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was absolute. Howard stared at the stark white paper in his trembling hands, as if it were a venomous snake. The arrogant bluster that had fueled his entire existence simply evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified old man. Beverly let out a strangled gasp and sank against the kitchen counter. Her legs completely gave out beneath her as the reality of losing her precious estate finally registered. Amanda looked back and forth between her devastated parents and my unwavering expression. The united front of their toxic family dynamic fractured right before my eyes. Amanda did not rush to comfort her mother or defend her father. Instead, she backed away, her face twisting into a mask of self-preservation. She practically ran out of my apartment, leaving her broken parents behind. I watched Howard and Beverly stumble out a few minutes later. They were just two desperate people facing the consequences of their malicious greed. On Monday morning, the true magnitude of my actions began to ripple through the financial district of Seattle. My network of professional contacts quietly informed me that federal agents had officially arrived at the prestigious investment firm where Preston worked. The Internal Revenue Service did not waste any time acting on the detailed ledgers I had securely forwarded to them. They immediately froze his corporate accounts and began heavily auditing his recent massive transactions. I knew Preston would be backed into a dangerous corner. A man who bases his entire identity on wealth and status becomes incredibly unpredictable when those things are abruptly stripped away. I also knew he would not have the courage to face me directly after I had thoroughly dismantled his father-in-law. He would look for a softer target. He would go after the one vulnerability he thought he could exploit. He would go after Lily. My maternal instincts flared into a bright, burning protective rage. I did not go to my downtown office that morning. Instead, I drove my car directly to the elite private high school Lily attended. I parked my sedan across the street from the wrought iron main gates and waited with absolute focus. The crisp morning air was sharp, but I rolled down my window to listen. I knew the schedule perfectly. Lily was currently safe inside the main building attending her advanced biology class. Preston arrived exactly 20 minutes before the lunch bell was scheduled to ring. He pulled his dark luxury SUV aggressively into the loading zone and killed the engine. He stepped out of the vehicle looking absolutely unhinged. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his tie was loose. He paced back and forth near the entrance, checking his watch. He was clearly planning to corner my 15-year-old daughter the moment she walked outside for her lunch break. He wanted to terrify a child into begging her mother to call off the federal dogs. I stepped out of my car and walked calmly across the street. I held my phone down by my side, my thumb resting lightly on the record button. Preston did not notice me until I was standing less than 5 feet away from him. He spun around and actually jumped backward in surprise. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red. I did not yell or raise my voice. I simply asked him what business a grown man had lurking outside a high school waiting for a teenage girl. He completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. He stepped aggressively into my personal space and pointed a shaking finger right at my face. He began ranting frantically about the federal agents swarming him. He threatened to make sure Lily never got accepted into a decent college. He hissed that I had completely ruined his flawless career. He demanded that I call the Internal Revenue Service immediately and retract my evidence or he would make my life a living hell. He yelled that he would personally ensure Lily suffered the consequences of my actions every single day of her miserable life. I stood perfectly still and let him exhaust his frantic, manic energy. I did not flinch or back away from his aggressive posturing. I waited until he was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion. Then I slowly lifted my phone and tapped the screen to stop the audio recording. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and smiled a very thin, cold smile. I told him he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire miserable life. I tapped the screen again, attaching the crisp, clear audio file to a newly drafted email. I had already populated the recipient list with the private email addresses of the entire board of directors at his prestigious investment firm. I deliberately added the personal email address of Amanda to the copy line. I looked up at Preston and told him his firm would be very interested to hear their senior partner threatening a minor child to cover up his federal financial crimes. I hit send. I watched the realization wash over his face as the notification chimed loudly on his own cellular device. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at it in horror. He knew his career was already hanging by a thread, and this recording was the final decisive cut. He looked up at me with his mouth hanging open, but no sound came out. I told him to get in his car and drive away before I called the campus security to report a dangerous trespasser. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own shoes, and practically dove into his vehicle. I watched him speed away down the street, his tires squealing against the pavement. I picked Lily up and we spent a peaceful evening in our apartment. I did not tell her about the desperate man who had tried to ambush her. Around 10:30 that night, long after Lily had gone to sleep, my personal cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. I let it ring twice before slowly answering the call. I did not speak. I simply listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. It was Preston. His voice sounded hoarse and completely broken, stripped of all its former arrogant pride. He was calling from a cheap prepaid burner phone, terrified that the federal agents were already monitoring his primary devices. He did not yell or issue any new threats. He sounded like a man who had finally realized he was drowning in the deep end of the ocean. He swallowed hard and offered me a desperate, pathetic bargain. He told me Amanda had locked him out of their house after she heard the recording. His firm had suspended him without pay pending a thorough internal investigation. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. He promised to give me the master passwords to the hidden offshore accounts Howard had been using to embezzle corporate funds for the past 20 years. He said those secret files contained enough solid evidence to put Howard behind bars for the rest of his natural life. He offered to hand over every single piece of damning information he possessed. He just wanted one thing in return. He begged me to contact the federal investigators and tell them he was merely an unwitting pawn in the massive financial crimes of his father-in-law. I did not give Preston the satisfaction of a response. I ended the call and let the silence of my dark apartment wash over me. The cowardice of the man was entirely predictable. He was willing to throw his wife and her family to the federal wolves to save his own skin from a prison cell. I knew exactly what to do next. The following morning, I sent a text message to Amanda. I suggested we meet at an exclusive coffee shop located in the heart of the downtown financial district. I kept the message deliberately vague, stating that we needed to discuss a formal truce before things escalated any further and caused irreparable damage to her social standing. I arrived 20 minutes early and secured a private corner booth near the back of the establishment. The shop was quiet, filled with the rich aroma of roasted beans and the soft hum of classical music. I ordered a simple black coffee and waited patiently. Amanda arrived exactly 15 minutes late, making me wait. She pushed through the heavy glass double doors, wearing a pristine white cashmere trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses. She carried her expensive leather handbag like a weapon as she scanned the busy room. When she spotted me sitting in the corner, her red lips curved into a triumphant, arrogant smile. She walked over to my table with the slow, deliberate strut of a woman who fully believed she had just won a major war. Amanda slid into the velvet booth opposite me and removed her sunglasses, setting them on the table. She signaled a passing barista with a snap of her fingers and ordered a tea without glancing at the menu. She leaned back against the cushions and crossed her arms, looking at me with pure condescension. She told me she was glad I had finally come to my senses and realized my mistake. She proudly declared that she knew I would eventually crack under the pressure of going up against their empire. I was just the bitter, impoverished sister who had thrown a temporary tantrum but ultimately realized I could never actually defeat the immense wealth and social power of the family. Amanda laughed softly, a mocking sound that grated against the quiet atmosphere. She told me Howard was still furious about the stunt I pulled with the lease, but she might convince him to call off the eviction if I formally apologized in writing. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wooden table. She lowered her voice and told me Preston had been stressed by my game with the federal investigators, but his elite legal team was already handling the situation effortlessly. She boasted loudly that Preston was completely untouchable because he was a brilliant financial mind who knew exactly how to protect their assets from any scrutiny. She went on about their upcoming vacation to the Maldives and how their perfect marriage was built on absolute trust. I sat perfectly still and let her speak. I let her construct a towering monument to her own blind arrogance and foolish pride. I watched the certainty shine in her eyes as she described a loyal husband who did not exist anywhere outside of her carefully curated delusions. When Amanda paused to take a sip of her tea, I reached into the front pocket of my jacket. I pulled out my cell phone and placed it flat on the table between us. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional reaction to her condescending speech. I simply told her that her loyal husband had called me late last night from an unregistered prepaid phone. Amanda scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. She stated that Preston would never waste his valuable time calling someone like me, especially after the pathetic scene I caused at the country club. I did not argue with her denial. I just reached out and tapped the screen of my phone. The audio file began to play instantly. The frantic voice of Preston filled the small space between us, echoing against the wooden table. Amanda froze in her seat. The delicate teacup in her hand began to tremble. The recording was clear and undeniable. Preston was crying on the audio track. He was frantically offering to turn over every single piece of evidence regarding the offshore embezzlement scheme of Howard. He explicitly promised to throw his father-in-law completely under the bus to save himself. He swore he would testify that Amanda and Beverly were fully aware of the stolen funds and entirely complicit in the laundering operations. He begged me through heavy sobs to help him secure a plea deal, offering up his entire family on a silver platter to save himself from a mandatory prison sentence. The audio file reached the end and the phone screen went dark. The silence at our table was deafening. Amanda stared blankly at the phone. Her perfect complexion had turned an awful shade of gray. The illusion of her wealthy marriage shattered right in front of my eyes. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as the magnitude of his betrayal crashed down upon her shoulders. Amanda slowly raised her gaze to meet mine. There was no arrogance left in her eyes. There was no condescension or smug superiority. There was only pure panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but her hands were shaking so violently she lost her grip on her drink. She dropped her delicate teacup. It shattered against the table, spilling hot liquid across the polished wood and splashing onto her cashmere coat. She did not even flinch at the burning mess. She scrambled out of the booth, knocking her chair backward onto the floor with a crash. She did not say a single word to me as she fled. She practically sprinted out of the coffee shop, leaving her expensive sunglasses abandoned on the table. She ran out into the busy street, frantically waving down a taxi and pulling open the door before it fully stopped. I sat quietly in the plush velvet booth, taking a sip of my coffee, and watched her speed away toward her penthouse. I knew exactly what she was rushing home to find, because forensic accounting is ultimately just tracking the inevitable flow of desperate money. Amanda rode the private elevator up to her penthouse suite in a state of absolute terror. She burst through the heavy double doors of her home, screaming the name of her husband at the top of her lungs. She stopped dead in her tracks at the entrance to their master bedroom. Preston was frantically zipping up a large designer suitcase on their bed. He was wearing casual travel clothes and looking wildly over his shoulder like a hunted animal. Standing right beside him, holding a matching leather overnight bag, was his 24-year-old administrative assistant. The young blonde woman was wearing one of the expensive custom silk scarves Amanda had bought during their honeymoon in Paris. Preston froze completely when he saw his wife standing in the doorway. Amanda screamed at him, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone to check their joint banking application. She prayed the recording was just a nightmare, but the screen loaded and confirmed her worst reality. Preston had spent the early morning hours completely emptying every single one of their shared domestic bank accounts. The realization that her perfect husband had abandoned her and stolen every last cent left Amanda screaming in the echoing foyer of her penthouse. Word of Preston fleeing the state spread rapidly through our family network. Howard was already suffocating under the weight of his collapsing empire, but the news of Preston completely liquidating Amanda destroyed his final financial lifeline. Howard had always assumed he could rely on the massive wealth of his son-in-law if his own shady investments ever caught up to him. Now his sprawling suburban estate was legally mine, and his offshore accounts were frozen by the federal government. He was a desperate trapped animal backed into a corner with no escape route and no remaining allies. Beverly was locked away in a high-end hotel, crying over her destroyed social standing and refusing to answer his frantic phone calls. Howard realized he only had one option left to maintain his lavish lifestyle and pay the exorbitant legal fees he was about to incur. He decided to target the original source of our family wealth. Great-Grandma Evelyn resided in an exclusive assisted living facility nestled in the quiet, upscale hills overlooking the city. She was 92 years old and possessed a massive family trust that Howard had been trying to get his hands on for 3 decades. Evelyn had always seen right through his arrogant bluster and firmly refused to grant him any access to her carefully managed portfolio. Howard knew the facility staff usually administered her evening pain medications right after dinner. He calculated that by 9 o'clock, she would be heavily sedated and entirely incapable of reading the fine print on any legal document. He printed a fraudulent power of attorney document that would grant him absolute control over her entire estate. He practiced a gentle, concerned voice, hoping to manipulate a groggy old woman into signing away her legacy. What Howard did not know was that Evelyn and I had been quietly speaking on the phone every single afternoon for the past 2 years. I had funded the private medical team that oversaw her specialized care. I knew everything about her schedule, and she knew everything about the financial crimes her son had committed. When I warned her that Howard was desperate, she simply laughed a sharp knowing sound and told me she was ready for him. The hallways of the facility were dimly lit and quiet as Howard slipped through the side entrance. He had used an old access code to bypass the main security desk. He crept down the carpeted corridor, checking over his shoulder to ensure no nurses were walking their evening rounds. He stopped outside the heavy oak door of her private corner suite and listened closely. Hearing nothing but the soft hum of the central heating, he slowly turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. The suite was cast in deep shadows with only a single reading lamp illuminated beside the large adjustable bed. Evelyn lay beneath a thick quilted blanket, her eyes closed and her breathing slow and rhythmic. Howard stepped inside and quietly pulled the door shut behind him. He walked over to the side of the bed and stood looking down at his mother. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded legal documents along with a heavy black ink pen. He leaned down and gently shook her shoulder. He whispered her name repeatedly, trying to rouse her from what he assumed was a deep, chemically induced sleep. Evelyn stirred slowly and let out a soft groan. She blinked her eyes open and squinted up at him, feigning grogginess and confusion. She asked him what he was doing in her room so late at night. Howard smoothed the crisp pages of the fraudulent power of attorney against the wooden tray table attached to her bed. He smiled a sickeningly sweet smile and told her not to worry. He explained that her regular attorneys had found a minor clerical error in her medical directives, and they simply needed her signature to correct the paperwork. He promised it was just a standard routine update to ensure she continued receiving the best possible care. He pressed the heavy pen into her fragile hand and pointed to the bottom line of the document. Evelyn did not look at the paper. She looked directly into the eyes of her son. She let her voice tremble slightly, maintaining the illusion of a weak, medicated old woman. She asked him if this had anything to do with the terrible rumors she had heard about him losing his house and his money. Howard tensed, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered and brushed off her concerns with a forced chuckle. He lied straight to her face, insisting his finances were perfectly secure and that people were just spreading vicious gossip because they were jealous of his immense success. He gently tapped the paper again, urging her to sign so she could go back to sleep. Evelyn let the pen slip from her fingers onto the blanket. She told him her hand felt too weak to write and asked him to read the document out loud to her. Howard let out a frustrated sigh. His patience was rapidly evaporating. He leaned closer, his voice dropping the sweet facade and taking on a harsh, demanding edge. He told her there was no time to read pages of legal jargon. He insisted she just needed to make a simple mark on the line. He grabbed her hand and tried to force her fingers back around the pen, physically attempting to coerce her into signing away her entire legacy. He snarled that she owed him this money after everything he had built for their family name. He hissed that she was going to die soon anyway, and he needed the trust to protect the estate from being taxed into oblivion. He admitted in his angry, frantic whispering that the funds were the only way he could stop the federal investigators from destroying him. Evelyn did not cry or pull her hand away. She simply smiled a sharp, brilliant smile that completely mirrored my own. She looked at him with absolute disgust and stated clearly that she would rather burn her money than let him use it to finance his crimes. Beneath the thick quilted blanket, Her other hand calmly pressed the silent panic button she had been holding since he walked into the room. The heavy oak door connecting her bedroom to the adjoining private sitting area suddenly swung open. I stepped out into the dim light, followed closely by two massive private security guards dressed in dark tactical suits. I was holding my cell phone steady, capturing crystal-clear video and audio of the entire interaction. Howard spun around, dropping the pen and the fraudulent documents onto the floor. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at me. He looked wildly around the room, realizing he had walked directly into a carefully orchestrated trap. I told him he had just confessed to attempted elder fraud and coercion on tape. Before Howard could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, the main doors to the suite burst open with tremendous force. 4 uniformed police officers rushed into the room, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet. The lead officer tackled him forcefully to the floor and read his rights. I watched as they hauled my father to his feet. Evelyn gave me a firm nod of approval from her bed. I handed my cell phone to the lead detective to ensure the video evidence was secured and followed the police cruisers downtown. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the main waiting area while the detectives processed the paperwork. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I felt incredibly calm. I knew the precinct would allow Howard one phone call. I knew exactly who he would call to beg for a massive legal bailout. Less than an hour later, the heavy glass doors of the waiting room swung open with a violent crash. Beverly stumbled into the building looking absolutely frantic. Her normally immaculate blonde hair was tangled and windswept. She was wearing an expensive cashmere coat thrown haphazardly over silk pajamas. She scanned the sterile room until her panicked eyes locked onto me. She let out a dramatic sob that echoed off the walls. She sprinted across the waiting room and collapsed completely. She fell to her knees on the dirty linoleum floor and grabbed the fabric of my trousers. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her pale face. Her entire body was shaking with exaggerated sobs. She begged me to tell the police there had been a massive misunderstanding. She pleaded with me to drop all the criminal charges against her husband immediately. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I did not pull my legs away from her grasping hands. I just sat still and let her perform. Beverly saw my blank expression and shifted her frantic strategy. She realized begging for mercy on behalf of Howard was a lost cause, so she decided to save herself. She tightened her grip on my clothes and began speaking in a rapid, desperate whisper. She swore she was entirely ignorant of his financial crimes. She cried that Howard kept her ignorant of his offshore accounts. She threw her own husband under the bus without hesitation. She leaned her head against my knee and whispered that Amanda was the real mastermind behind all the cruelty. She claimed Amanda and Preston had manipulated Howard into taking desperate measures. She sobbed that she was just a helpless victim. She told me family must always stick together when the outside world attacks. She begged me to protect her from the mess my father and sister created. I listened to her pathetic lies and felt a profound sense of closure. She was willing to sacrifice her favorite daughter and her husband to maintain her comfortable illusion of innocence. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone. Beverly stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting to the device in confusion. She asked me what I was doing and sniffled loudly, wiping a tear from her cheek. I did not answer her. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contacts. I tapped a single name and placed the phone flat on the wooden bench right next to my leg. I pressed the speakerphone icon and waited while the line rang. The sound echoed in the quiet waiting room. Beverly stared at the phone with growing apprehension. The line clicked open on the third ring. The voice of my 15-year-old daughter filled the space. Lily sounded perfectly awake and entirely calm. I looked down at Beverly and told Lily that her grandmother had something she wanted to say about the importance of family sticking together. Before she could utter a single syllable, Lily began to speak. Lily did not raise her voice. She spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded absolute attention. She addressed Beverly directly through the speaker. She asked her grandmother if she remembered a very specific night 5 years ago. She asked if Beverly remembered hosting a massive, flawless holiday party for her wealthy country club friends. Lily calmly recounted how I had worked a double shift that evening and could not afford a babysitter. I had brought a 10-year-old Lily to the sprawling suburban estate, hoping she could quietly watch television in a back bedroom. Lily recalled walking out of the guest room because she wanted a glass of water. She described accidentally bumping into a small decorative table in the hallway and knocking over a crystal vase. The vase had shattered quietly on the carpet, but Beverly had been standing right around the corner. Lily recounted exactly what happened next, with a chilling lack of emotion. She told the phone speaker how Beverly had dragged her toward the heavy mahogany front doors. Beverly had been terrified that her wealthy guests would see the awkward, poorly dressed grandchild who ruined her perfect aesthetic. Lily recited the exact words Beverly had spoken to her that night. She recalled how her grandmother had looked down at her with absolute disgust. Beverly had called her a clumsy, unwanted burden who was ruining the most important night of the year. Beverly had told a 10-year-old girl that she did not belong inside a beautiful house filled with successful people. Lily reminded Beverly how she had pushed her out onto the freezing stone porch without a winter coat. Lily spoke the exact cruel sentence Beverly had used right before she slammed the heavy doors shut. Beverly had told her to wait out in the freezing snow because the cold was exactly where a pathetic mistake belonged. Lily recounted how she had sat shivering on that icy stone bench for 3 solid hours, crying quietly until my shift ended and I came to pick her up. She reminded her grandmother that I had found her blue from the freezing wind, while the sounds of warm laughter drifted through the thick windows of the estate. Beverly stared at the phone on the wooden bench. Her jaw hung slack, and her face was completely drained of all color. The fabricated tears had dried up instantly, replaced by genuine terror. She slowly moved her hands away from my trousers and shrank back onto the floor. She realized that the helpless little girl she had casually tortured was now the exact person holding the key to her entire future. Lily paused for a moment, letting the heavy silence stretch out in the sterile police station. When she spoke again, her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of any mercy. She told her grandmother that she remembered every single detail of that freezing night. She stated that actions have permanent consequences and time does not erase deliberate cruelty. Lily delivered her final message with absolute flawless composure. "You shut the door on me when I was freezing. Now we are shutting the door on you." The line clicked and went completely dead. The silence in the waiting room was absolute. I looked down at the woman shivering on the linoleum floor. I calmly picked up my cell phone from the wooden bench and slid it back into my jacket pocket. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my trousers where her desperate hands had wrinkled them. I stepped around her kneeling form. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I walked steadily across the scuffed floor and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the precinct, stepping out into the cool night air. I walked toward my car feeling truly free, without a single backward glance at the broken woman I left behind. I walked toward my car feeling truly free without a single backward glance at the broken woman I left behind. The drive back to my apartment building was quiet and peaceful. I parked in the secure garage and rode the elevator up to my floor. My apartment was warm and inviting. Lily was already asleep. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the large window over the Seattle skyline. I took a sip and savored the absolute silence of my home. Perfect silence was abruptly shattered by the harsh buzzing of the lobby security intercom. The sudden noise startled me. It was nearly midnight and I was not expecting any visitors. The intercom buzzed a continuous sound that indicated someone was leaning their weight against the call button. I walked over to the security tablet mounted on the wall near my front door and tapped the screen to activate the live video feed. The high-definition camera in the main lobby illuminated the space perfectly. Standing in the center of the elegant entryway was Amanda. She looked completely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant socialite who had sat across from me in the coffee shop just a few days ago. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled and heavily stained. Her hair was a tangled mess falling wildly around her shoulders. She was dragging two mismatched overnight bags that looked like they had been packed in a blind panic. She slammed her hand against the intercom button again, her face twisting into a mask of pure desperation. I pressed the communication button and asked her what she was doing in my building at this late hour. Amanda gasped when she heard my voice echoing through the lobby speakers. She abandoned her bags and rushed right up to the camera lens. She immediately demanded that I unlock the secure glass doors and let her upstairs. Her voice was shrill and frantic, bouncing off the marble walls of the spacious lobby. I watched her panic-stricken face through the digital screen and felt absolutely no sympathy. I told her there were plenty of motels on the outskirts of the city that accepted cash. She slammed her fists against the reinforced glass doors and began to scream. She leaned into the intercom and demanded that I let her move into my apartment immediately. She ordered me to give her my guest bedroom and insisted it was my duty as her sister to support her through this temporary setback. She was standing in the lobby of a building that I completely owned, demanding that I surrender my own home to accommodate her massive ego. I simply told Amanda that she was not welcome in my building and that her status meant absolutely nothing to me. I informed her that if she did not leave the premises immediately, I would have her forcibly removed. I stood in my quiet hallway and watched the silent video feed as the reality of my rejection washed over her. When she finally realized that I was not going to open the doors, something inside her completely snapped. The last remaining threads of her sanity unraveled right there in the lobby. She let out a silent scream of pure primal rage and began kicking the thick glass doors with her expensive shoes. When the reinforced glass refused to break, she spun around and looked for a softer target. Amanda marched over to the nearest planter and grabbed the rim with both hands. She grunted with effort as she tipped the massive ceramic pot backward. She hoisted the heavy planter up and hurled it directly at the security doors. The ceramic shattered upon impact, sending dark soil and tangled roots exploding across the pristine lobby. The loud crash must have echoed throughout the entire ground floor. Amanda did not stop there. She marched over to the second planter and shoved it over, kicking the ceramic until it broke into jagged pieces. She was shrieking at the top of her lungs, waving her arms frantically and cursing my name. She yelled that she was better than everyone in this miserable city. She screamed about her Ivy League education and her expensive tastes as she actively destroyed private property like a petulant toddler. She grabbed her heavy overnight bags and swung them against the walls, knocking down a decorative mirror and shattering the glass. Her public meltdown was spectacular and entirely uncontrollable. I watched the destruction unfold on the tablet screen with complete emotional detachment. I did not need to call the authorities myself, because her violent display was already drawing a massive crowd. The Horizon Management Group building was home to many residents who valued their peace and security. The sounds of breaking glass and screaming quickly alerted the people living in the first-floor apartments and the loft spaces overlooking the lobby. I watched through the camera feed as several residents stepped out of the elevators and onto the mezzanine balconies to see what was causing the massive disturbance. They stood in their pajamas and robes, looking down at the wild woman tearing apart their beautiful entryway. Multiple people immediately pulled out their cell phones to record the unbelievable scene. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers illuminated the street outside the glass doors. The sudden arrival of the authorities did not calm Amanda down. It only amplified her hysterical rage. Two uniformed officers pushed through the outer doors and stepped carefully into the ruined lobby. They ordered Amanda to drop her bags and step away from the broken planters. Amanda spun around and glared at the officers with absolute venom. She completely ignored their commands and began marching toward them, waving her arms aggressively. She demanded that they arrest me instead. She shrieked that I had stolen her inheritance and ruined her marriage. She yelled that she was a highly educated woman and they had no right to tell her what to do. She actually tried to push past the lead officer to get out the door. The police officers did not tolerate her entitled behavior for a single second. The lead officer grabbed her arm and spun her around, forcing her against the wall. Amanda fought back, thrashing wildly and kicking at the officer's shins. She screamed obscenities and threatened to have their badges stripped away by morning. Her resistance only made the situation worse. The second officer grabbed her other arm, and together they wrestled her into handcuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply in the lobby. Amanda suddenly realized the reality of her situation. The anger evaporated and was instantly replaced by hysterical, terrified crying. She sobbed, begging the officers to let her go, claiming she was the true victim. She cried that she was wearing expensive clothes and the handcuffs were hurting her wrists. The officers ignored her pathetic pleas and hauled her toward the exit. The residents standing on the balconies continued to film the entire humiliating arrest from their doorways, capturing every second of her spectacular downfall. I stood in my quiet apartment and watched the security feed as the police shoved my crying sister into the back of a squad car. She was hauled away into the night, leaving behind nothing but a ruined lobby and the shattered remains of her miserable, entitled life. I turned off the tablet screen and walked back into my living room feeling completely at peace. I was finally free from their toxic family drama. But my peace was only a brief intermission in the final act of this war. His legal team secured his release on bail the morning after his disastrous attempt to manipulate Evelyn. He was facing severe criminal charges, but his arrogance convinced him he could still salvage his empire. He knew the trial would take months, and he still held the title of Chief Executive Officer. He intended to use the company to crush us before the federal investigators could fully dismantle his life. Howard summoned the board of directors for a clandestine emergency meeting at the corporate headquarters late on a Friday evening. He deliberately bypassed the standard notification protocols, hoping to keep the gathering entirely off the radar of Evelyn and myself. His legal strategy was transparent. He had unearthed a loophole in the corporate bylaws regarding the mental fitness of majority shareholders. His ultimate goal was to convince the board to legally strip Evelyn of her voting rights by declaring her medically incompetent. Once her shares were neutralized, he planned to execute a hostile maneuver to freeze me out of the family enterprise forever. He wanted to lock down the corporate accounts and use the operational funds to finance his criminal defense. The executive boardroom was located on the top floor of the downtown high-rise. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The board members sat in uneasy silence. These wealthy men and women had profited alongside Howard for years, but the recent rumors of federal investigations made them incredibly nervous. Howard stood at the head of the table wearing a pristine tailored suit that completely hid the reality of his crumbling life. He rested his hands on the wood and projected absolute confidence. He lied smoothly to the assembled directors. He claimed the recent gossip about his finances was a smear campaign orchestrated by rivals. He then lowered his voice, adopting a tone of deep artificial sorrow as he spoke about his mother. He told the board that Evelyn was suffering from severe cognitive decline and that I was manipulating her failing mind to steal the family assets. He distributed highly questionable medical opinions purchased from a corrupt private physician. Howard urged the board to act decisively to protect the company. He called for an immediate vote to invoke the bypass clause and strip Evelyn of her executive authority. He assured them this was the only way to safeguard their dividends and protect the legacy of the enterprise. The board members murmured among themselves, passing the fraudulent medical assessments back and forth. A few of his oldest allies nodded in agreement, preparing to raise their hands and seal our fate. Just as Howard opened his mouth to officially call the vote, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Howard looked up, expecting to see a late-arriving director or a secretary bringing refreshments. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face the moment he saw me standing in the doorway. He had not expected me to march into his fortress. I walked into the room with slow, deliberate steps, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I was certainly not alone. Flanking me were two senior partners from the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the city. Howard sputtered, demanding to know how I had bypassed building security. He ordered me to leave the room immediately, shouting that this was a closed executive session. I ignored his pathetic blustering and walked directly toward the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I pulled out a stack of documents stamped with the official seal of the state Supreme Court. I slid the papers smoothly across the polished wood toward the lead corporate counsel sitting near Howard. I announced to the silent room that I was not a trespasser. I was there as the sole legally appointed representative of the majority shareholder. The documents were ironclad proxy authorizations signed by Evelyn and validated by a judge that very afternoon. The corporate counsel examined the documents closely and gave a grim nod to the board, confirming my absolute authority to be present and to vote on behalf of Evelyn. Howard turned a sickly shade of gray, but he refused to surrender. He slammed his fist against the table and shouted that my proxy meant nothing. He sneered that I was just a bitter, estranged daughter trying to throw a tantrum in a room full of serious business professionals. He demanded the board ignore me and proceed with the vote to strip my power. I did not engage with his frantic shouting. I simply signaled to the attorneys standing behind me. One of them stepped forward and placed a massive heavy binder down onto the exact center of the mahogany table. It hit the dark wood with a loud, resounding thud. It was a 500-page forensic audit compiled by the independent accounting firm the board used for their annual reviews. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every single director. I told them to open the binder before they cast a vote that would make them accessories to massive corporate fraud. I explained the audit undeniably proved Howard had been embezzling from the family trust and the corporate accounts for a decade. He had not just been making incredibly poor and reckless business choices. He had been actively siphoning millions of dollars through phantom vendor accounts to cover his catastrophic failed investments. I instructed the board to turn to a specific tab in the binder, their faces contorted in shock as they reviewed the itemized ledgers. The documents tracked the money with terrifying precision. The audit showed massive cash transfers routed through shell companies directly into Amanda and Preston's joint accounts to finance their lavish lifestyle. The board saw the exact amounts used to pay for luxury vehicles, exotic vacations, and exorbitant penthouse renovations. Every penny was stolen from the dividends that belonged to the company. Howard had treated the corporate treasury like his personal piggy bank, assuming his authority would shield him from scrutiny. I told the board that the federal investigators already possessed identical copies of this audit. I warned them that supporting Howard now meant legally binding themselves to a man about to be indicted for financial crimes. Howard practically lunged across the table trying to grab the binder. He screamed that the numbers were fabricated and that I was trying to frame him. His voice cracked with panic as he looked at his former allies. The large room suddenly erupted into absolute chaos. The wealthy directors were extremely furious. These people cared only about their wealth and realized Howard had put it in severe jeopardy. The lead counsel immediately advised the board that continuing to support Howard was corporate suicide. The loyalists who had been nodding along now glared at him with pure hatred. The board instantly turned on him. They ignored his frantic pleas and bypassed his proposed agenda. Instead, the directors initiated an immediate emergency vote of no confidence. It was unanimous. Within 5 minutes, they stripped Howard of all his executive titles and officially terminated his employment. They voted to cancel his remaining company shares, citing the breach of fiduciary duty clause in his contract. Finally, the board voted to completely freeze and seize his remaining personal assets to cover the entirety of the stolen funds. 2 burly security guards wearing the corporate logo stepped forward immediately. They did not wait for Howard to gather his dignity. They grabbed him by the arms and physically marched him out of the executive boardroom. Howard stumbled over his own expensive leather shoes as they dragged him down the long corridor toward the private elevator. The man who had ruled this building with absolute authority just an hour ago was now being ejected like a common trespasser. He shouted threats and cursed at the guards, but his voice cracked with raw panic. The ride down to the ground floor was agonizingly slow. The polished steel doors finally slid open, and the guards pushed him through the expansive marble lobby. Employees stopped and stared in shock as their former chief executive officer was forcibly paraded past the reception desk. The guards shoved him through the heavy revolving glass doors and out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. Howard staggered forward and nearly fell into the busy street. He caught his balance and turned around, breathing heavily. His pristine tailored suit was wrinkled and his silk tie hung askew. He stared up at the towering glass skyscraper that no longer belonged to him. He was completely destitute, disgraced, and facing years in a federal prison cell. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb directly in front of him. The rear passenger door swung open and Beverly stepped out onto the sidewalk. She was wearing a large pair of designer sunglasses and a tight expression of absolute fury. Howard let out a ragged sigh of relief, assuming his wife had somehow heard the news and rushed downtown to support him. He took a step toward her, reaching out with trembling hands. Beverly did not reach back. She took a sharp step away from him, her eyes scanning the busy street to ensure none of her wealthy socialite friends were watching this humiliating spectacle. She looked at her husband with a mixture of profound disgust and seething anger. She demanded to know if the rumors rapidly spreading through their country club network were true. She asked if he had actually been fired and stripped of his shares by his own board of directors. Howard dropped his hands and stared at her. The last remaining shreds of his composure shattered right there on the crowded sidewalk. He did not offer an apology or try to comfort her. He simply exploded. Howard screamed at Beverly with a vitriolic rage that caused pedestrians to stop and stare. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face and blamed her for every single catastrophic failure in his life. He shouted that her insatiable need to keep up appearances was the only reason he had been forced to embezzle money from the company and the family trust. He listed her exorbitant expenses at the top of his lungs. He yelled about the massive country club fees, the constant luxury vacations, the designer wardrobes, and the endless cosmetic procedures. He told her she was a financial black hole that could never be satisfied. He shrieked that he had spent 10 years drowning in debt just to maintain the flawless, wealthy facade she demanded. He blamed her for Amanda and her endless sense of entitlement. He screamed that Beverly had raised a daughter who bled him dry and then married a coward who stole whatever was left. He told his wife that he was going to federal prison because of her greed. Beverly did not flinch at his screaming. She simply stood perfectly straight and adjusted her expensive silk scarf against the cold city wind. She looked at the man she had been married to for over 3 decades and felt nothing but cold, calculated self-preservation. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She did not yell back or attempt to defend her lavish spending habits. She simply stepped forward and slapped the heavy envelope directly against his chest. Howard reflexively caught the package before it hit the pavement. He looked down at the thick stack of papers and then back up at his wife in pure confusion. Beverly calmly informed him that he had just been legally served with divorce papers. She stated, her voice carrying a chilling lack of emotion, that she was entirely dissolving their marriage effective immediately. Howard stared at the divorce petition in absolute shock. His jaw dropped as the magnitude of her betrayal crashed over him. He asked her how she could possibly abandon him when he had absolutely nothing left. Beverly let out a sharp, condescending laugh that cut through the noise of the busy street. She leaned in close to him and whispered that she knew he was lying about being completely destitute. She stated that a man as paranoid and controlling as him would never leave himself entirely exposed. She confidently declared that she knew he had hidden funds stashed away in secret offshore accounts long before the federal investigators started digging into his corporate files. She smiled a terrible, greedy smile and told him she had hired the most vicious divorce attorneys in the state. She promised to ruthlessly drag him through civil court until she legally claimed half of whatever hidden assets remained before the government could seize them. She turned her back on him, completely prepared to climb back into her waiting town car and leave him rotting on the sidewalk. Before her hand could even touch the handle of the car door, a tall man in a dark charcoal suit stepped out from the shadows of the building awning. He was followed closely by a second man carrying a slim leather briefcase. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of highly paid corporate litigators. I walked out through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, just in time to watch my attorneys intercept my mother on the pavement. Beverly froze her hand, hovering over the door handle. She recognized the men instantly from the brutal boardroom meeting she had heard about only moments ago. The lead attorney stepped directly into her path, blocking her escape route. He did not introduce himself or offer any polite pleasantries. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a crisp white legal envelope. He held it out to her with a blank professional expression. Beverly stared at the envelope but refused to take it. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and demanded to know what they wanted. She haughtily declared that she was not a part of the company and had absolutely nothing to do with her husband and his pathetic financial crimes. She insisted they were harassing an innocent woman who was currently in the middle of a highly stressful divorce. The attorney did not argue with her. He simply let the envelope drop onto the hood of her black town car. He informed Beverly that the document was an official notification from the federal authorities. He explained in a calm, steady voice that her secret offshore accounts, the ones she assumed were perfectly safe from the fallout, had just been completely frozen. Beverly gasped, her eyes widening in genuine terror. She snatched the envelope off the hood of the car and tore it open, ripping the paper in her frantic haste. She scanned the legal notice, her hands shaking so violently the pages rattled. The attorney continued speaking, ensuring she understood the absolute severity of her situation. He explained that the forensic audit I had just presented to the board proved undeniably that she was fully aware of the origins of the stolen money. The paper trail showed she had knowingly and willingly spent embezzled corporate funds to finance her lavish lifestyle for over a decade. He stated that the federal government does not allow criminals to keep the proceeds of their crimes. He told her she was legally implicated as a direct accessory to massive corporate fraud and money laundering. He delivered the final crushing blow without a single ounce of pity. He informed her that every single asset she possessed was now federal property, and she was getting absolutely nothing. The horrific reality of those words hung in the cold city air as Beverly stood frozen on the sidewalk. She watched my attorneys turn and walk away, leaving her with a worthless piece of paper and a completely ruined life. Over the next few agonizing days, the federal government swept through their lives with brutal efficiency. The sprawling suburban estate was locked down. The luxury cars were impounded. The offshore accounts were entirely frozen. Howard, Beverly, and Amanda were left with only the clothes on their backs. They were forced to retreat to a dingy, cheap motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. The three of them were trapped in a single cramped room, suffocating in their mutual hatred and blaming each other for their spectacular downfall. They had hit absolute rock bottom when a sharp knock on their flimsy motel door delivered a tiny sliver of delusional hope. A formal courier handed them a thick cream envelope stamped with the gold seal of the estate attorneys representing Great-Grandma Evelyn. The letter was a mandatory summons demanding their immediate presence for a final reading of her living will. Howard read the script, and his mind began spinning an optimistic narrative. He convinced himself his mother was stepping in to save them from total disgrace. Beverly and Amanda eagerly latched onto this pathetic fantasy. They believed Evelyn was going to release a massive portion of her trust fund to bail them out of their legal nightmare. The following morning, they arrived at the downtown skyscraper housing the legal firm. I was sitting quietly in the reception area when the elevator doors slid open. The sight of my former family was genuinely pathetic. Howard wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit purchased from a discount rack. His face was unshaven and his hands trembled as he clutched his briefcase. Beverly looked haggard without her expensive blowout and thick cosmetics. Her coat was severely wrinkled and heavily stained. Amanda looked frantic, dragging her feet as she walked. Her hair was greasy and pulled into a messy knot. Despite their disheveled appearance, they still carried a sickening air of arrogant entitlement. Amanda glared at me sitting on the sofa and scoffed loudly. She whispered to her mother that I was probably there to beg for a handout from the estate. A junior associate in a gray suit stepped into the reception area and formally invited us into the main conference room. We walked down a long corridor lined with frosted glass and entered a massive boardroom. The space was dominated by an enormous polished oak table, surrounded by heavy leather chairs. Sitting at the absolute head of the table was great-grandma Evelyn. She was flanked by two senior partners who looked incredibly serious and prepared. Evelyn did not look like the frail, heavily medicated woman Howard had tried to coerce in the assisted living facility. She looked sharp, immaculate, and entirely lucid. She wore a pristine, tailored blazer, and her silver hair was perfectly styled. She sat with the straight, rigid posture of a queen preparing to pass absolute judgment. I walked around the long table and took the empty leather chair directly to her right. Howard, Beverly, and Amanda awkwardly shuffled toward the opposite end of the table and took their seats. Howard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. His eyes were gleaming with greedy anticipation. He offered his mother a sickeningly sweet smile and thanked her for bringing them together during such a difficult time. He stated he knew she would never let the family be dragged through the mud. Evelyn did not return his smile. She stared at him with an expression of profound glacial disgust. She raised a single steady hand to silence him before he could utter another pathetic lie. She turned her attention to the lead attorney sitting to her left and nodded gracefully. The attorney opened a thick leather-bound folder and cleared his throat. He announced to the room that Evelyn had chosen to execute a comprehensive living will. He explained she was legally distributing and securing all her assets prior to her passing to ensure her wishes were honored without future interference. Howard nodded eagerly, salivating at the thought of a massive cash infusion to save his skin and pay his legal fees. The attorney finished his remarks and stepped back, allowing Evelyn to take full control of the proceedings. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Evelyn looked directly at her son. Her voice was strong and echoed with unwavering authority. She told Howard she had spent decades watching him operate with moral bankruptcy. She stated he had built his life on a foundation of lies, greed, and deceit. She turned her sharp gaze toward Beverly. Evelyn dismantled my mother with a few devastating sentences. She told Beverly her materialistic existence had actively enabled and encouraged the destruction of their family. Evelyn then shifted her intense focus entirely onto Amanda. Amanda shrank back slightly under the weight of her grandmother's piercing stare. Evelyn berated her granddaughter for her absolute sense of blind entitlement. She told Amanda that she was a parasitic and lazy woman who had married a man just as pathetic and cowardly as she was. Evelyn folded her hands elegantly on the table and delivered the final crushing verdict. She stated formally, legally, and unequivocally that she was permanently disinheriting all three of them. She declared that they would not receive a single cent from her vast estate. Howard gasped out loud, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Beverly covered her mouth with trembling hands. Amanda simply stared in blank, uncomprehending shock. Evelyn was not finished. She leaned forward slightly and made sure they absorbed every single word of her justification. She told them that they had sealed their own miserable fate a long time ago. She looked directly into their panicked eyes and stated that their inheritance was officially spent the exact moment they turned a freezing 15-year-old away in the snow. She made it crystal clear that the heartless cruelty they inflicted upon me when I was just a vulnerable teenager was the exact moment they lost everything. The devastating reality of her words hung heavily in the quiet boardroom. Evelyn calmly explained that the massive fortune they coveted so desperately was going entirely to the one person they threw away like garbage. She had legally transferred the absolute totality of her immense portfolio into an ironclad trust managed exclusively by me. The heavy silence was suddenly shattered by Amanda. She leaped out of her leather chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed against the floor. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The last remaining threads of her sanity snapped entirely. She began screaming at Evelyn at the top of her lungs. Amanda wildly pointed a shaking finger at her grandmother and called her a senile, crazy old woman. She shrieked that the living will was a complete joke and an absolute fraud. She slammed her hands down on the polished oak table and frantically declared she was going to tie up the entire estate in civil court for decades. She screamed she would contest the living will on the absolute grounds of Evelyn being medically and mentally incompetent. She stood there shrieking vicious threats and demanding her money, completely unaware of the final, inescapable legal trap I had laid out for them. Amanda's shrieking echoed off the polished oak paneling of the boardroom, her voice shrill and desperate as she paced behind her heavy leather chair. She waved her arms frantically, spouting wild accusations of senility and manipulation. Howard watched his daughter's spectacular meltdown for a few moments, before a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He adjusted the cuffs of his cheap, ill-fitting suit and stood up, placing a hand on Amanda's shoulder to silence her. He looked down the length of the table at Evelyn and me, his eyes gleaming with malicious confidence. He leaned forward and rested his knuckles on the table, declaring that Amanda was absolutely right. He promised to file endless motions and competency hearings that would drag this living will through the civil court system for the next 10 years. Howard's voice grew louder and more aggressive as he outlined his strategy of legal attrition. He boasted that he would bleed the entire estate completely dry with exorbitant legal fees before he ever allowed me to see a single penny. He sneered that Evelyn was a frail, confused old woman who had clearly been coerced into signing documents she did not comprehend. Beverly chimed in from her seat, nodding vigorously in agreement. She clutched her stained designer coat and added that they would drag my name through the mud. They fed off each other's delusion, building a fantasy where their threats of endless litigation would force us to surrender and write them a massive settlement check just to make them go away. Evelyn did not flinch at their vicious threats. She sat perfectly still, radiating a calm, untouchable dignity. She simply looked at me and offered a small, knowing nod. I remained comfortably seated in my leather chair and allowed Howard to finish his pathetic, blustering monologue. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there panting with a triumphant grin, I reached down to the polished floor and lifted my slim leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. The sharp click of the brass latches echoed loudly in the sudden silence of the room. I slowly opened the briefcase and retrieved a thick, heavily tabbed legal binder. I placed it squarely on the wood in front of me and rested my hands on top of it. I told him his threats were meaningless because there was nothing left to contest. Howard scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as he crossed his arms over his chest. He demanded to know what nonsense I was talking about, reminding me that Evelyn's portfolio was worth tens of millions of dollars. I opened the thick binder and flipped to a section marked with a bright red tab. I explained that while Evelyn indeed possessed a vast fortune, she also held absolute executive control over the family enterprise that he had spent the last decade systematically looting. I reminded Howard of the forensic audit I had presented to the board of directors just a few weeks prior. I stated that the audit had exposed a massive, undeniable trail of corporate embezzlement and systemic fraud orchestrated by him and eagerly facilitated by Beverly and Amanda. I turned to the next page in the binder and smoothed it flat against the table. I informed my disgraced family that the corporate board had not just fired Howard and frozen his personal assets. They had also calculated the exact financial damage he had inflicted upon the enterprise. The total sum of the embezzled funds, combined with the corporate penalties and the immediate restitution demanded by the federal investigators, came to exactly $2.5 million. Howard's face drained of color as the staggering number hung in the air. He tried to brush it off, stammering that the federal charges were a separate issue and had absolutely nothing to do with Evelyn's living will. He insisted that the estate was still legally bound to provide for him as a direct descendant regardless of any pending litigation. I smiled at him with genuine, unadulterated satisfaction. I told him he was fundamentally misunderstanding the brilliant, inescapable trap his mother had meticulously designed. I explained that Evelyn was not just the matriarch of the family. She was the majority shareholder of the enterprise he had robbed. As part of her living will, Evelyn had chosen to actively clean up the disastrous mess her son had created. She had legally stepped in to satisfy the corporate board and the federal investigators. I pulled a certified document from the binder and slid it down the length of the mahogany table. It came to a stop directly in front of Howard. He stared down at the paper, his eyes darting across the dense legal text as his breathing grew shallow and erratic. I narrated the contents of the document for the benefit of Beverly and Amanda, who were staring at Howard in growing panic. I explained that Evelyn had utilized a specific portion of her vast personal wealth to completely pay off the $2.5 million restitution debt owed to the family enterprise. She had written a massive check to clear the corporate ledgers and satisfy the federal mandates, effectively neutralizing the immediate financial crisis he had triggered. Howard looked up from the document, a flicker of desperate delusional relief washing over his haggard face. He let out a shaky laugh and told his mother that he knew she would never let him go to federal prison. He actually thanked her, believing she had just bailed him out of his massive legal debt and wiped his slate clean. He arrogantly assumed the money she spent was simply an advance on his inheritance. My smile widened as I watched him fall directly into the deepest part of the snare. I shook my head slowly and shattered his pathetic illusion. I told Howard that Evelyn had not paid off his debt out of maternal love. She had purchased his debt as a calculated strategic investment. I instructed him to turn to the second page of the document lying in front of him. Howard's hands trembled violently as he flipped the heavy parchment paper. I explained the fatal legal mechanism that was currently locking its jaws around his throat. When Evelyn paid the $2.5 million to the corporate board, she did not forgive the debt. She legally acquired it. The restitution debt was officially transferred from the enterprise directly into her personal portfolio. She owned his massive financial liability in its absolute entirety. Beverly gasped, her hands flying to her throat as the terrifying reality began to dawn on her. Amanda looked frantically between her parents, demanding someone explain what was happening. I ignored them and kept my eyes locked on Howard, who was staring at the signatures, validating his destruction. I delivered the final piece of information. I reminded him that Evelyn's living will transfer her assets into an ironclad trust managed exclusively by me. I explained that this included all outstanding debts owed to her estate. Holding up the certified transfer agreement, I told Howard that his massive debt had been legally transferred into my corporate entity. I had inherited their absolute financial ruin. Howard, Beverly, and Amanda sat absolutely frozen in their leather chairs with profound terror. I smiled warmly at my terrified family. I am now your sole creditor. You owe me $2.5 million payable immediately. I suggest you start packing your bags right now. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute, as the crushing reality of my words destroyed whatever remaining defiance they held. The legal mechanisms I had set in motion were totally ruthless and incredibly immediate. My corporate legal team had already anticipated every possible desperate countermeasure they might attempt, ensuring there was absolutely no escape from the devastating consequences. Within 48 hours, federal marshals and the estate executors arrived at their sprawling suburban mansion to enforce the asset seizure. Howard and Beverly were given exactly 2 hours to gather whatever inexpensive personal items they could fit into a few canvas bags before the locks were changed forever. The luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, the priceless jewelry, and the fine art were all cataloged and impounded. They were stripped of their entire identity and forced out onto the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of a $2.5 million debt hanging over their heads. With their bank accounts frozen and their credit scores obliterated, they had no choice but to seek shelter in the only place that would accept cash with no background check. Howard and Beverly rented a dingy, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the industrial outskirts of the city. The transition from a pristine mansion to a squalid tenement was a brutal shock to their systems. Their new reality smelled of stale cigarette smoke, boiled cabbage, and damp rot. They had to haul their few remaining possessions up 4 flights of dimly lit stairs because the elevator had been broken for years. The apartment itself was a miserable claustrophobic box with peeling yellow wallpaper and a single window that looked out over a brick alleyway. They could not afford actual furniture, so they slept on a cheap stained mattress they found at a discount thrift store. The sounds of wailing police sirens and domestic disputes echoed through the paper-thin walls day and night. Howard and Beverly spent their hours trapped in that tiny room, blaming each other for their spectacular downfall. The resentment between them was toxic and suffocating, but they were financially shackled together in their shared misery. Amanda was completely cut off from her parents and abandoned by her cowardly husband. She was forced to face the real world without a single safety net or a dime of the trust fund she had always relied upon. She had no marketable skills, a worthless degree, and a toxic reputation that made professional employment impossible. Facing imminent starvation and eviction from her own temporary housing, she was forced to accept a minimum wage job as a cashier. The ultimate irony was that she was hired at a high-end organic grocery store in the very same upscale neighborhood she used to treat as her personal playground. Amanda was handed a stiff green polyester uniform polo and a plastic name tag. She was forced to stand behind a scanning register for 8 grueling hours a day. The physical labor of standing bagging groceries and dealing with the general public was pure torture for a woman who had spent her entire life being weighted on hand and foot. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, and her hands were dry and cracked from breaking down cardboard boxes. She glared at every customer who walked through her lane, seething with bitter resentment as she watched them purchase the expensive artisan foods she could no longer afford. She tried to maintain an air of arrogant superiority, but the uniform stripped away any illusion of power. Her absolute nightmare materialized on a busy Tuesday afternoon. Amanda was staring blankly at the scanner when she heard the familiar high-pitched laughter of 2 women approaching her lane. She looked up and felt the blood drain completely from her face. Walking toward her register were Chloe and Jessica, 2 of her former closest friends from her exclusive country club circle. They were dressed in immaculate designer clothes, holding expensive leather handbags, and chatting casually about an upcoming charity gala. Amanda panicked and tried to pull her uniform cap down over her face, but it was too late. Chloe placed a basket of organic produce on the conveyor belt and glanced at the cashier. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in genuine shock. She tapped Jessica on the arm and pointed at Amanda. The 2 wealthy women stared at their former friend in her hideous green polo shirt. Amanda desperately tried to salvage her shattered dignity. She forced a rigid smile and lifted her chin, attempting to project her old arrogant status. She lied smoothly, claiming she was just working at the market as a temporary social experiment to ground herself before launching a new corporate venture. She expected them to nod along and invite her to coffee like the old days. Instead, Chloe and Jessica just looked at her with an expression of cold, mocking pity. They did not indulge her pathetic fantasy for a single second. Chloe let out a sharp, dismissive laugh and told Amanda to just make sure she did not bruise the organic avocados while she bagged them. Jessica did not even make eye contact. She simply tapped her manicured fingernails against the counter and complained that the checkout line was moving too slowly. They treated Amanda exactly like the invisible hired help she had always openly despised. The crushing realization washed over Amanda as she mechanically scanned their luxury items. She had been entirely erased from their social world. She handed them their receipt with trembling hands and watched them walk away laughing together without a single backward glance, leaving her trapped behind a register in a polyester shirt. Miles away in their miserable apartment, Howard and Beverly sat in absolute silence on the edge of their stained mattress. The small room was dark, illuminated only by the flickering glow of a bulky, outdated television set Howard had salvaged from the alleyway. The picture was grainy and washed out, the damaged antenna barely catching the local broadcast signal. They were eating cold canned soup directly from the tin because they could not afford to pay the gas bill to use the stove. The local evening news transitioned from the weather report to a feature segment on local high society. The anchor spoke with bright enthusiasm about a massive philanthropic event taking place downtown. The camera panned across a beautifully decorated ballroom filled with elegant floral arrangements and the wealthiest elites in the city. Howard paused his plastic spoon halfway to his mouth. Beverly leaned closer to the static-filled screen, her eyes widening in pure disbelief. Stepping up to the polished podium in the center of the ballroom was me. I was wearing a stunning sapphire evening gown and projecting an aura of absolute serene power. Standing right beside me, holding my hand and beaming at the crowd, was Lily. The television anchor praised my visionary leadership and commended my recent decisive takeover of the family enterprise. He detailed the millions of dollars I had just pledged to a charity supporting underprivileged youth. Howard dropped his plastic spoon onto the floor. Beverly let out a choked, agonizing sob. They sat shivering in their dark, decaying apartment, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the stench of cabbage. They could only stare helplessly at the flickering screen, completely paralyzed by their own misery, watching the daughter they had thrown away effortlessly rule the empire they had lost forever. The flashing cameras of the local press illuminated the grand entrance of the newly constructed community center. I stood at the polished podium, looking out over the crowd of local dignitaries, community organizers, and journalists who had gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The evening air was warm and filled with a palpable sense of hope and achievement. The building behind me was a sprawling state-of-the-art facility, designed specifically to provide shelter education and resources for marginalized youth and struggling mothers. It was a project born from the ashes of my own painful past and funded entirely by the exact $2.5 million of embezzled money I had recovered from Howard. Instead of allowing those funds to sit completely idle, I had legally diverted absolutely every single cent into this foundation. I wanted the money my former family had stolen out of pure greed to be used to protect the vulnerable people they had always despised. Lily stood right beside me, radiating a quiet, confident maturity that made my chest ache with pride. She was no longer the frightened little girl who had to hide from her wealthy relatives. At 15 years old, she possessed a remarkable poise and an unwavering sense of self-worth. She wore a simple, elegant dress that perfectly matched the sapphire fabric of my own gown. Together, we presented a united, unshakable front to the city that was watching our every move. The mayor had just finished giving a glowing speech about our philanthropic efforts and stepped back to allow us to officially cut the thick silk ribbon draped across the main doors. I reached for the oversized ceremonial scissors and offered one handle to my daughter. As we prepared to make the final cut, a sudden chaotic commotion erupted near the edge of the velvet ropes, separating the VIP area from the public sidewalk. A harsh, shrill voice cut through the polite applause of the audience. The polite murmurs of the crowd morphed into gasps of shock as a frantic figure shoved her way past a local news cameraman and stumbled directly onto the red carpet. It was Amanda. The contrast between the elegant attendees and my sister was jarring and deeply pathetic. She looked absolutely terrible. Her hair, which used to be professionally styled every single week, was greasy and pulled back with a cheap plastic clip. She was wearing her bright green grocery store uniform polo shirt, which was heavily stained and heavily wrinkled from a long shift of manual labor. Dark bags hung heavily under her panicked eyes, and her posture was stooped from utter exhaustion. She looked nothing like the arrogant country club socialite who used to look down on the rest of the world. She pushed past a startled event coordinator and aggressively marched right up to the base of the podium. The journalists immediately turned their cameras toward the disruption, hungry for a scandal. I lowered the ceremonial scissors and looked down at her with a completely blank expression. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or anger. I felt absolutely nothing. Amanda stood at the bottom of the steps, panting heavily, as she stared up at my designer gown and the immaculate facade of the new building. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, and her hands shook violently at her sides. She pointed a trembling finger at the community center and demanded to know how I could spend millions of dollars on strangers while my own sister was forced to ring up groceries for minimum wage. Her voice was shrill and cracking with desperation as she loudly complained about her aching feet and the humiliating way her former friends treated her at the store. She wildly declared that she could not take another day of standing behind a cash register being treated like a peasant. She gripped the edge of the podium and looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. She abandoned her aggressive tone and shifted into a pathetic whining plea. She begged me to give her a management position at the new foundation or an executive role at the main corporate enterprise. She insisted that she deserved a high-paying salary and a corner office because of her last name. She shamelessly played the family card, loudly reminding me that we were sisters and that blood was supposed to mean something. She promised she would be a loyal employee if I just gave her a chance to prove her worth and get her ruined life completely back on track. She swore that she had learned her lesson and was absolutely ready to be a productive member of our new corporate family. She rambled on, spouting empty promises and desperate justifications while the entire crowd watched in stunned silence. I did not move a single muscle. I did not lean forward to comfort her or step back in disgust. I simply let her stand there and expose her own pathetic greed to the local media. I realized in that moment that I did not even need to speak. I did not need to defend my choices or explain the consequences of her past cruelty. Her frantic begging was the ultimate proof of her absolute failure. Before I could even formulate a thought to dismiss her, Lily calmly released her grip on the ceremonial scissors and took a deliberate step forward. My 15-year-old daughter moved to the edge of the podium and positioned herself directly between Amanda and me. The crowd collectively held its breath as the young teenager looked down at the haggard, desperate woman who had once treated her existence as a dirty secret. Lily did not raise her voice or show a single trace of emotion. She stood perfectly straight with her shoulders squared and her chin held high, projecting an intimidating aura of absolute authority that commanded immediate respect. Amanda stopped rambling and looked up at her niece with a mixture of confusion and lingering entitlement. She opened her mouth to demand that Lily step aside and let the adults talk, but the words died in her throat. Lily met her aunt's panicked gaze with an expression of profound glacial indifference. She looked at Amanda as if she were nothing more than a minor scheduling error that needed to be corrected. Lily folded her hands in front of her and delivered a crushing verdict that echoed through the courtyard. She stated calmly that they did not hire liabilities. The sheer weight of that single sentence shattered Amanda completely. Lily did not wait for a response. She simply raised her hand and offered a brief, subtle signal to the private security team standing near the entrance. Two very large men in dark suits immediately stepped forward and grasped Amanda firmly by the elbows. Amanda let out a loud, agonizing wail as they turned her around and began marching her down the red carpet. She twisted and thrashed in their grip, sobbing uncontrollably as the cameras flashed, capturing every second of her spectacular disgrace. She looked back over her shoulder and locked eyes with Lily one final time. In that fleeting moment, the devastating reality finally pierced through her delusion. Amanda realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she was entirely powerless against the niece she had once called a stain. Her pathetic cries faded into the busy street as we turned back to the crowd very unbothered, and we smiled very warmly. Amanda's frantic screaming continued to echo off the frosted glass of the boardroom walls. She paced furiously behind her leather chair, waving her arms and spewing venomous insults at her grandmother. Howard watched his daughter unravel for several moments before a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He adjusted his cheap discount suit and stood up from the oak table, placing a hand on Amanda's shoulder to quiet her. He looked down the length of the massive table and locked his greedy eyes onto mine. His shock had evaporated and was rapidly being replaced by a sickening sense of supreme overconfidence. Howard puffed out his chest and loudly declared that his daughter was absolutely right. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the dark wood, and promised to file endless injunctions and competency hearings the very next morning. He swore he would drag this ridiculous living will through the civil court system for the next 15 years if he had to. His voice grew louder as he proudly outlined his malicious legal strategy. He boasted that he would bleed the entire estate completely dry with exorbitant lawyer fees and relentless litigation before he ever allowed me to see a single penny. He sneered that Evelyn was a frail, confused old woman who had obviously been coerced into signing complex financial documents she could not comprehend. Beverly eagerly chimed in from her seat across the table, nodding her head vigorously in aggressive agreement. She clutched her stained, wrinkled coat and added her own vicious threats to the conversation. She shrieked that they would take this story to the local media and drag my professional reputation through the mud until I was completely ruined. They fed off each other's desperate delusion, building a fantasy where their threats of endless legal warfare would force Evelyn to surrender and write them a massive settlement check. They genuinely believed they still held the power to intimidate us into total submission. Evelyn did not flinch at their vicious, empty threats. She sat perfectly still in her heavy leather chair, radiating a calm, untouchable dignity that made them look even more pathetic. She simply looked at me and offered a small, knowing nod, indicating that it was time to close the trap. I remained comfortably seated and allowed Howard to finish his blustering, arrogant monologue. I wanted him to feel absolutely certain of his victory before I pulled the floor out from under him. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there panting with a triumphant, cruel grin, I reached down to the floor and lifted my slim leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches echoed loudly in the sudden tense silence of the boardroom. I slowly opened the lid and retrieved a thick, heavily tabbed legal binder. I placed it squarely on the polished wood in front of me and rested my hands lightly on the cover. I looked directly into Howard's gleaming eyes and told him his threats of litigation were completely meaningless because there was absolutely nothing left for him to contest. Howard scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling as he crossed his arms defiantly over his chest. He demanded to know what kind of desperate nonsense I was talking about, reminding me that his mother's portfolio was currently worth tens of millions of dollars. He arrogantly stated that there was plenty of wealth to fight over, and he was prepared to scorch the earth to get his rightful share. I opened the thick binder and flipped past several dense contracts until I reached a section marked with a bright red plastic tab. I calmly explained that while Evelyn indeed possessed a vast personal fortune, she also held absolute executive control over the family enterprise that he had spent the last decade systematically looting. I reminded Howard of the comprehensive forensic audit I had personally presented to the corporate board of directors just a few weeks prior to this meeting. I stated clearly that the audit had exposed a massive, undeniable trail of corporate embezzlement and systemic fraud orchestrated entirely by him and eagerly facilitated by Beverly and Amanda. I turned to the next page in the heavy binder and smoothed it flat against the table. I informed my disgraced family that the corporate board had not just fired Howard and frozen his personal assets pending investigation. They had also calculated the exact catastrophic financial damage he had inflicted upon the enterprise. The total sum of the embezzled corporate funds combined with the severe regulatory penalties and the immediate financial restitution demanded by the federal investigators came to exactly $2.5 million. Howard's face instantly drained of color as that staggering, terrifying number hung heavily in the quiet boardroom. He swallowed hard and tried to nervously brush the information away, stammering that the federal fraud charges were an entirely separate legal issue and had absolutely nothing to do with the execution of Evelyn's living will. He frantically insisted that the estate was still legally bound to provide for him as a direct blood descendant, regardless of any pending corporate litigation or federal investigations. I smiled at him with genuine, unadulterated satisfaction, relishing the sheer panic swimming behind his eyes. I shook my head slowly and told him he was fundamentally misunderstanding the brilliant, inescapable legal trap his mother had meticulously designed for him. I explained that Evelyn was not just the aging matriarch of the family, she was the majority shareholder of the enterprise he had so brazenly robbed. Evelyn had chosen to actively clean up the disastrous financial mess her son had created. She legally stepped in to satisfy the corporate board and appease the federal investigators. I pulled a certified document from the binder and slid it smoothly down the mahogany table. The thick paper came to a stop directly in front of Howard. He stared down at the document, his eyes darting frantically across the text as his breathing grew incredibly shallow. I explained that Evelyn had utilized her personal wealth to completely pay off the $2.5 million fraud restitution debt. She wrote a certified check to clear the corporate ledgers and satisfy the federal mandates, effectively neutralizing the financial crisis he had triggered. Howard looked up, a flicker of desperate delusional relief suddenly washing over his haggard face. He actually thanked her, believing she had just bailed him out of his massive legal debt and wiped his slate clean out of maternal loyalty. My smile widened as I watched him fall directly into the snare. I leaned forward and shattered his pathetic illusion. I told Howard that Evelyn had not paid off his massive debt out of love. She had purchased his debt as a strategic financial investment. When Evelyn paid the $2.5 million, she did not forgive the debt. She legally acquired it. The massive fraud restitution debt was officially transferred from the enterprise directly into her personal portfolio. I reminded him that Evelyn's newly executed living will transfer the totality of her assets into an ironclad trust managed exclusively by me. Holding up the transfer agreement, I told Howard his massive corporate debt had just been legally transferred directly into my corporate entity. I smiled warmly at my terrified family. I am now your sole creditor. You owe me $2.5 million payable immediately. I suggest you start packing your bags.